October 12, 1944, 06:15 a.m., Formosa Island. A reconnaissance report landed on Captain Toshikazu Omai's desk. The paper was still damp from the humid morning air. The radio operator's handwriting was hurried, almost panicked. Omai read it once, then twice. His hands trembled. 8 American aircraft carriers. Position 180 miles east-northeast. Speed 25 knots. Estimated aircraft complement 480. He checked his watch. The sighting was transmitted at 05:58, 17 minutes ago. 17 minutes of precious time already gone. Omai did the mathematics in his head. At 25 knots, the carriers had already closed 15 nautical miles. They were now 165 miles offshore. If the Americans launched immediately after being spotted, their aircraft would reach Formosa in 45 minutes. Maybe less. The operations room had perhaps 15 minutes before American carrier planes filled the sky over every airfield on the island. 15 minutes. That was all Japan had. 15 minutes to scramble fighters. 15 minutes to save hundreds of aircraft from destruction. 15 minutes to mount some kind of defense against a force that had already crushed Japanese air power at Truk, Palau, Guam, and Saipan. Omai had served in the Imperial Japanese Navy for 22 years. He had watched carrier aviation evolve from experimental curiosity to the dominant weapon of naval warfare. He had stood on the deck of the carrier Akagi on December 7, 1941, watching 183 aircraft launch toward Pearl Harbor. That morning, Japan ruled the Pacific. Now, 3 years later, he was watching that empire crumble in real time. And there was nothing he could do to stop it. The reconnaissance pilot who spotted the American fleet was Lieutenant Takeshi Yamada. He was 23 years old. He had been flying reconnaissance missions for 8 months. His job was simple but deadly. Search the ocean east of Formosa. Find American carriers. Report their position. Do not engage. Yamada found them at 0540. 8 carriers in formation surrounded by screening vessels, cruisers, destroyers, a floating fortress of steel and aircraft stretching across miles of ocean. He transmitted his sighting report immediately, then turned away before American combat air patrol fighters could intercept him. His Nakajima C-6N reconnaissance plane was fast, 375 miles per hour at altitude. But Hellcats were faster. Yamada knew better than to linger near American carriers. His job was to report what he saw. Others would have to deal with it. He flew back toward Formosa, wondering if the airfields he was returning to would still exist when he arrived. Vice Admiral Shigeru Fukudome commanded 2nd Air Fleet. He had arrived in Formosa in August with a single mission: rebuild Japanese air strength after the catastrophic losses in the Marianas. Prepare for the coming battle in the Philippines. Hold the line until reinforcements arrived. Fukudome was in his quarters when Omai brought him the reconnaissance report. He read it without expression. His face revealed nothing, but his mind was racing through calculations he had made 100 times before. 8 carriers, 480 aircraft, distance closing every minute. His 2nd Air Fleet had approximately 700 aircraft on Formosa. That sounded impressive. It was meaningless. Those aircraft were scattered across multiple airfields. Many were still being assembled or repaired. Fuel was already in short supply. Ammunition was running low. And his pilots ranged from barely trained replacements to a handful of exhausted veterans who had somehow survived 3 years of continuous combat. Against 480 American carrier planes flown by experienced pilots in superior aircraft, Formosa's air defenses were inadequate. Fukudome knew this. He had known it for months. But knowing something and accepting it are different things. He walked to the operations room. The sun was fully up. Visibility unlimited. Perfect flying weather. The Americans had chosen their timing well. They always did. Order all airfields to launch immediately, Fukudome said. Everything that can fly. Get them airborne before the Americans arrive. His voice was calm. His orders were clear. Inside, he was preparing for disaster. The American carriers approaching Formosa represented something that would have been inconceivable 3 years earlier. Task Force 38. 17 carriers total, 9 fleet carriers, 8 light carriers. Operating in 4 task groups, each one more powerful than the entire Japanese carrier fleet at its peak. The Americans had built an industrial machine that produced Essex-class carriers in 16 months. Shipyards at Newport News, Philadelphia. Norfolk and Quincy worked around the clock. 3 shifts, 7 days a week. Steel arrived by rail. Armor plate was cut and welded. Turbines were installed. Carriers slid down the ways every few weeks, each one displacing 27,000 tons. Each one carrying 90 aircraft. Japan could not match this production. All of Japan's shipyards combined could not produce carriers at 1/10 the American rate. The Kuri Naval Arsenal, Yokosuka, Sasebo, all working at maximum capacity, all falling further behind every month. Worse, even if Japan could somehow build the carriers, there were no pilots to fly from them. The carrier air groups that had struck Pearl Harbor were gone. Dead at Coral Sea. Dead at Midway. Dead over Guadalcanal. Dead in the Philippine Sea just 4 months earlier. The survivors had been rotated to training commands where they desperately tried to teach replacement pilots skills that took years to develop. They were failing. There was no time. The Americans were coming too fast. American carrier pilots were experienced veterans. Many had 50, 60, 70 combat missions. They flew Grumman F-6F Hellcats. Top speed 380 miles per hour. Dive speed over 450 miles per hour. Rugged construction that could absorb damage that would destroy a Zero instantly. 650 caliber machine guns with 400 rounds of ammunition. The pilots had been trained extensively in deflection shooting boom and zoom tactics coordinated section attacks. They had radar allowing them to vector toward targets with precision Japanese pilots could only dream of. And they had numbers. The 8 carriers detected off Formosa could launch 480 aircraft in a single coordinated strike. This was not theoretical. American carriers had demonstrated this capability repeatedly over the past 6 months. At Truk, at Palau, at Guam, at Saipan. Each time Japanese air bases that had taken years to build were reduced to rubble in a single morning. Each time Japanese commanders received reconnaissance reports, just like the one Omai was holding. Each time there had been 15, maybe 20 minutes between detection and the first bombs falling. The pattern was always the same. Detection, desperate scramble, overwhelming attack, destruction. Across Formosa, air raid sirens began to wail. Fighters scrambled. Pilots sprinted to their aircraft. Ground crews yanked wheel chocks. Engines coughed and roared to life. The sound of radial engines filled the morning air, a sound that had once represented Japanese air power ranging freely across the Pacific, now reduced to desperate last stands on isolated islands. Lieutenant Shinji Nakamura climbed into his A6M0 at Matsuyama Airfield. He was 24 years old. He had been flying combat missions for 6 months. He had survived longer than most replacement pilots. Survival taught hard lessons. He knew the Americans would come from above. They always did. He knew they would attack in coordinated sections. They always did. He knew his Zero could outturn a Hellcat, but could not outrun one, outdive one, or absorb the punishment one could deliver. He knew the mathematics of the coming battle favored the Americans in every category except one. Japanese pilots were willing to die. Nakamura strapped in, ran through his pre-flight checks, and taxied toward the runway. Above him, the sky was clear and blue. It would not stay that way for long. The first wave of American fighters appeared over Formosa's northern coast at 06:57. Hellcats from Task Group 38.2. 48 fighters in sections of 4 climbing to 25,000 feet. They swept over the coastline like a scythe. Nakamura was climbing through 15,000 feet when he spotted them. Silver aircraft far above. Contrails streaming behind them in the cold upper air. He counted at least 30, probably more beyond visual range. His squadron had 12 aircraft. The mathematics were brutal. He keyed his radio. Enemy fighters high. Many aircraft. Proceeding to intercept. He pushed his throttle forward. The Zero climbed well at this altitude. He might reach 20,000 feet before they engaged. He never made it. The Hellcats dove on his squadron from above and behind. Altitude converted to speed. Speed converted to killing power. Nakamura saw tracer fire flash past his canopy. He broke hard left. The Zero responded instantly. A Hellcat flashed past, unable to follow the tight turn. Nakamura reversed, trying to get on his attacker's tail. Another Hellcat appeared from below, climbing with excess speed from its dive. Muzzle flashes from 650 caliber guns. His Zero shuddered. Rounds tore through thin aluminum skin. The left wing fuel tank exploded. Fire erupted along the wing route. 5 seconds, maybe less. Nakamura jettisoned the canopy and rolled inverted. The slipstream tore him from the cockpit. His parachute opened at 12,000 feet. Below him, his Zero spiraled downward, trailing black smoke. Around him, more aircraft were burning. Some Japanese, some American, mostly Japanese. The air battle lasted 23 minutes. Japanese fighters shot down 9 American aircraft. American fighters shot down 53 Japanese aircraft. For every American lost, Japan lost 6. At 0720, the dive bombers arrived. SB-2C Helldivers from 3 task groups. 136 aircraft carrying 1,000-pound bombs. They approached from 20,000 feet. Each squadron assigned specific targets. Tainan Air Base, Takao Airfield, Shinchiku, Matsuyama. Every major airfield hit simultaneously. The Helldivers rolled into 70-degree dives, speed building to 350 miles per hour. Pilots used perforated dive brakes to maintain control. At 3,000 feet, bombs released. Pilots pulled out with G-forces that grade their vision. 1,000-pound bombs cratered runways. Penetrated revetments. Destroyed aircraft in their shelters. Each bomb created a crater 25 feet across, 15 feet deep. Tainan received 38 bombs in the first strike. 7 direct hits on the main runway. 11 on the taxiway. 20 in the dispersal area where fighters were being fueled and armed. After the dive bombers came the torpedo bombers. TBM Avengers configured as horizontal bombers. 72 aircraft carrying 4 500-pound bombs each. They hit fuel storage, maintenance facilities, headquarters buildings. At Takao, fuel storage tanks erupted in fireballs, visible from 20 miles away. 80,000 gallons of aviation gasoline. Months of careful accumulation from convoys out of Singapore and Borneo. Gone in seconds. By 08:00, the first strike was complete. American aircraft reformed and flew back toward their carriers. Formosa's airfields were burning. 150 Japanese aircraft destroyed on the ground or in the air. The Americans lost 18 aircraft, less than 4% of their strike force. Fukudome received damage reports throughout the morning. Every airfield reported heavy damage. Tainan, non-operational. Takao, 3 runways damaged. Shinchiku fuel storage destroyed, 42 aircraft lost. Matsuyama, 70% of fighter strength destroyed. The mathematics were exactly what he had predicted. And the Americans were not finished. At 0930, reconnaissance reported the carriers launching a second strike. Same composition. 400 aircraft. Arrival time, 11 Soro. The Americans could launch, recover, rearm, refuel, and launch again. Their supply ships carried thousands of tons of aviation gasoline bombs ammunition. Their mechanics worked with mechanical efficiency. Their operational tempo was relentless. Japan could not match this. Japanese carriers launched single strikes, then withdrew to safe harbors. Japanese supply ships were hunted by American submarines. Japanese mechanics worked without spare parts. The second strike hit at 11:05. By noon, 2nd Air Fleet had lost 230 aircraft, 50 in air combat, 180 on the ground. Operational aircraft numbered fewer than 400, many damaged, most lacking fuel. Fukudome stood at the window watching his command burn. Every Japanese aircraft destroyed was irreplaceable. Every Japanese pilot killed represented hundreds of training hours that could never be recovered. The Americans could lose 50 aircraft and have replacements within a week. Japan could not lose 20 without crippling its defensive capabilities. This was the mathematics of attrition warfare fought by an industrial superpower against a nation stretched beyond its limits. Fukudome had spent his career believing that Japanese fighting spirit could overcome material disadvantages. That determination and courage could compensate for fewer ships, fewer aircraft, fewer resources. The Formosa strikes were proving him wrong. When the Americans wanted to neutralize an airbase, they sent 8 carriers with 500 aircraft. When defenders tried to counterattack, American radar detected them from 100 miles away. When Japanese pilots pressed attacks with suicidal bravery, American anti-aircraft fire and fighter superiority made survival nearly impossible. The 15-minute window between detection and attack had become Japan's recurring nightmare. Not enough time to evacuate. Barely enough time to scramble. Just enough time to understand that overwhelming force was coming and nothing could stop it. This pattern would repeat in the Philippines, at Iwo Jima, at Okinawa, at the home islands themselves. And somewhere in the burning wreckage of Formosa's airfields, desperate men were already discussing a desperate solution. If conventional attacks could not penetrate American defenses, perhaps unconventional ones could. If pilots were going to die anyway, perhaps their deaths could be made more effective. In Part 2, we will see how this overwhelming American advantage pushed Japan toward the most terrifying tactical innovation of the Pacific War. The mathematics of industrial warfare were about to give birth to something that would haunt both nations for generations. The kamikazes were coming. October 14, 1944, 14:30 p.m. Formosa Island. In Part 1, you witnessed the most devastating carrier strike in Pacific history. Task Force 38 launched 480 aircraft from 8 carriers. They destroyed 230 Japanese aircraft in a single day. Japanese commanders had 15 minutes of warning. 15 minutes to watch their air power disintegrate. Admiral Fukudome stood in the ruins of 2nd Air Fleet headquarters, calculating losses he could not replace. The mathematics were brutal. For every American aircraft shot down, Japan lost 6. But here is where the story takes a darker turn. Combined Fleet headquarters in Tokyo did not accept defeat. They ordered Fukudome to launch a counterattack against the American carriers. Maximum effort. All available aircraft. And Fukudome, despite knowing the odds, obeyed. 180 aircraft took off from Formosa's damaged airfields that afternoon. Only 22 came back. The rest were shot down by American fighters who detected them 80 miles from the carriers. But that is not the worst part. The worst part is what happened after the counterattack failed. Japanese commanders told Tokyo they had won. They claimed to have sunk 11 American carriers. They claimed a great victory. This lie would lead directly to the deaths of 10,000 Japanese pilots. And this is how it happened. Vice Admiral Shigeru Fukudome faced an impossible choice on the evening of October 14th. His 2nd Air Fleet was shattered. Operational aircraft numbered fewer than 200. Fuel reserves were critical. Ammunition was exhausted. Every major airfield on Formosa required weeks of repair before normal operations could resume. The American carriers remained on station launching strikes whenever they chose. His counterattack had been a catastrophe. Lieutenant Kenji Watanabe was one of the 22 survivors. He landed at Matsuyama with 37 bullet holes in his Zero. His wingman was dead. His squadron was destroyed. He reported to the operations officer with hands still shaking. "The Americans were waiting for us," Watanabe said. "They knew we were coming before we saw them. Their fighters were at altitude. They attacked from above. We never had a chance." Fukudome heard similar reports from every returning pilot. The American radar had detected the Japanese formation at extreme range. Fighter directors had vectored 60 Hellcats to optimal intercept position. The Japanese strike never got within 50 miles of the carriers. 158 aircraft lost, 0 hits on American ships. Fukudome drafted his situation report with careful precision. Counterattack launched 14:30 hours. Results negligible. Losses severe. American carrier task force intact. He sent it to Combined Fleet Headquarters and waited for a response. The response came from Admiral Soemu Toyoda himself. The message questioned Fukudome's assessment. Pilots from 3rd Air Fleet, operating independently from the Philippines, had reported multiple torpedo hits on American carriers. Observation aircraft claimed to have seen burning ships. Radio intercepts suggested American distress calls. Surely Fukudome's assessment was too pessimistic. Fukudome read Toyoda's message with growing unease. He knew what his pilots had reported. He knew the American carriers were untouched. But 3rd Air Fleet was claiming victories. Someone was lying, or someone was mistaken. In the chaos of aerial combat, pilots often overclaimed. They saw explosions and assumed hits. They saw smoke and assumed sinking ships. This was not unique to Japanese aviators. American pilots overclaimed as well. But the scale of 3rd Air Fleet's claims was extraordinary. They reported hitting 11 carriers. They reported sinking at least 4. They reported a great victory that had turned the tide of the Pacific War. Fukudome knew this was impossible. His reconnaissance aircraft had photographed the American task force that morning. 8 carriers, all operational, all launching aircraft, none showing damage. He sent a follow-up message to Tokyo, carefully worded but clear. 2nd Air Fleet observation confirms American carriers intact. Recommend verification of 3rd Air Fleet claims before public announcement. The response crushed any hope of honesty. Imperial General Headquarters had already announced the victory. Emperor Hirohito had sent congratulations. The Japanese people were celebrating in the streets. Newspapers proclaimed the destruction of American carrier power in the Pacific. There would be no correction. There would be no verification. The lie had become official truth. And here is where everything went catastrophically wrong. Admiral Soemu Toyoda was not a fool. He suspected the victory claims were exaggerated, but he faced pressures that Fukudome could not understand. Japan needed a victory. The home front needed hope. The military needed justification for continued resistance. If the Formosa air battle was announced as a devastating Japanese defeat, what remained of national morale might collapse entirely. So Toyoda made a calculation. Perhaps the claims were partly true. Perhaps some carriers had been damaged. Perhaps the exaggeration served a greater purpose. He approved the official announcement. He sent congratulations to surviving pilots. He recommended decorations for valor. Then he made the decision that would doom 10,000 men. He ordered the Philippines' defense plan to proceed on the assumption that American carrier strength had been crippled. Operation Show 1, the decisive battle for the Philippines, was built on a lie. Japanese planners assumed American carriers were damaged and demoralized. They assumed Japanese land-based aircraft could achieve air superiority over the invasion beaches. They assumed the remaining Japanese carriers could operate without overwhelming American opposition. Every assumption was wrong. The American carriers were intact. American morale was higher than ever. American pilots were confident and experienced. The victory at Formosa had demonstrated their absolute superiority in carrier operations. Fukudome understood this. He tried to communicate reality through official channels. His messages were ignored or dismissed. The lie had taken on a life of its own. But Fukudome was not the only officer who recognized the truth. Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi arrived in the Philippines on October 17th. He was assigned to command 1st Air Fleet, responsible for land-based naval aviation in the Philippine Islands. Onishi was brilliant, ruthless, and realistic. He reviewed the operational situation with cold mathematical precision. 1st Air Fleet had approximately 100 operational aircraft. The Americans were approaching with 17 carriers. Even accepting Tokyo's inflated victory claims the odds were impossible. Onishi did not accept the inflated claims. He had seen the reconnaissance photographs. He had read Fukudome's reports. He knew the American carriers were intact. He knew conventional attacks were suicide. And that word suicide sparked an idea that had been forming in Japanese military circles for months. What if suicide was not a failure of tactics, but a feature? What if pilots volunteered to crash their aircraft deliberately into American ships? What if the certainty of death became a weapon? Onishi summoned his senior staff on October 19th. He laid out the mathematics. American combat air patrol fighters intercepted Japanese strikes at 80 miles. American anti-aircraft fire created walls of steel at close range. Conventional attacks required pilots to survive approach, deliver weapons, and escape. Survival was nearly impossible. But what if escape was removed from the equation? A pilot committed to death could press his attack through any defense. He did not need to pull out of his dive. He did not need to evade anti-aircraft fire. He needed only to reach his target and crash. The aircraft became the bomb. The pilot became the guidance system. This is insane. One staff officer protested, "We are asking men to commit suicide." Onishi's response was cold. "We are asking men to die with purpose. They will die anyway. This way their deaths accomplish something." The debate lasted hours. Some officers supported the concept. Others found it morally repugnant. All agreed on one point. Conventional tactics had failed completely. Something new was required. On October 20th, 1944, American forces landed on Leyte Island in the Philippines. This was the moment Japan had prepared for. The decisive battle. Operation Show 1. Japanese naval forces converged on the Philippines from multiple directions. Battleships, cruisers, destroyers. The remnants of the carrier fleet reduced to decoy status because there were no trained air groups to operate from them. And 1st Air Fleet Onishi's command, with barely 100 aircraft facing 17 American carriers. Onishi made his decision. He called for volunteers. He explained what he was asking. Deliberate suicide attacks against American carriers. One-way missions. Certain death. To his surprise, and perhaps his horror, volunteers stepped forward immediately. Young pilots. Barely trained replacements who had no chance of surviving conventional combat anyway. They saw meaning in sacrifice. They saw honor in death. They saw a chance to strike back at an enemy that had become seemingly invulnerable. The first organized kamikaze unit was designated Shimpu Special Attack Unit. Shimpu was an alternate reading of the characters for Kamikaze Divine Wind, the typhoon that had destroyed Mongol invasion fleets in the 13th century. The pilots chosen for the first mission were young. Average age 22. Flight experience minimal. Combat experience almost non-existent. They were given brief training in ship identification and approach tactics. They were told to aim for carrier flight decks. They were told their deaths would save Japan. On October 25, 1944, the first organized kamikaze attack struck American escort carriers supporting the Leyte landings. 5 Zeros each carrying a 250-kilogram bomb approached the escort carrier group off Samar. American Combat Air Patrol was engaged elsewhere, dealing with conventional Japanese attacks. The kamikazes approached at low altitude, avoiding radar detection. They climbed at the last moment and dove on their targets. The escort carrier St. Lo took a direct hit. The kamikaze crashed through the flight deck and exploded in the hangar. Secondary explosions ripped through the ship as armed aircraft and fuel ignited. St. Louis sank in 30 minutes. 113 men killed. It was the first major American warship sunk by deliberate suicide attack. The news of St. Louis sinking electrified Japanese commanders. A single Zero with a 250-kilogram bomb had accomplished what hundreds of conventional attacks had failed to achieve. The mathematics suddenly looked different. If kamikazes could sink carriers at a rate of 1 ship per 5 aircraft, the equation changed dramatically. American carriers were no longer invulnerable. More kamikaze units were organized immediately. Volunteers continued to come forward. The program expanded from a desperate experiment to official doctrine. By November 1944, hundreds of Japanese pilots were training for one-way missions. Flight schools that had once taught combat tactics now taught approach angles for suicide dives. Aircraft factories that had struggled to produce fighters capable of matching Hellcats now produced simpler aircraft designed only to reach their targets and crash. The industrial mathematics that had doomed Japanese conventional aviation created a terrible logic for suicide attacks. Japan could not build aircraft fast enough to replace combat losses. But Japan could build aircraft fast enough if those aircraft only needed to fly one mission. Japan could not train pilots fast enough to match American skill. But Japan could train pilots fast enough if those pilots only needed to take off, navigate to target, and crash. The kamikaze program was not born from fanaticism alone. It was born from mathematics. The same mathematics that had made American carrier superiority overwhelming now made suicide attacks the only viable response. Admiral Toyota approved expanded kamikaze operations on October 28. His message to unit commanders was characteristically direct. The fate of the empire depends upon this operation. Every unit must do its duty with complete devotion. There would be no half measures. There would be no retreat. There would only be attack until death or victory. American commanders were slow to recognize what they faced. The St. Louis sinking was initially attributed to a lucky hit by a damaged aircraft whose pilot had chosen to crash rather than ditch. But the attacks continued. November 1st, November 5th, November 25th. Each time, Japanese aircraft approached differently than conventional attackers. They did not drop bombs and turn away. They did not release torpedoes and attempt to escape. They pressed directly into American ships with obvious suicidal intent. Anti-aircraft gunners who had learned to track aircraft expecting evasive maneuvers found themselves shooting at pilots who flew straight. The kamikazes accepted hits that would force conventional pilots to abort. They absorbed damage that would destroy their aircraft and kept flying toward their targets. They required not merely hits, but destruction to stop them. By late November, American intelligence had confirmed what shipboard observers suspected. The Japanese had organized deliberate suicide attacks as standard doctrine. Young pilots were being recruited, trained, and sent to die in calculated sacrifice. The kamikazes were coming, not as individual acts of desperation, but as strategy. And American carriers, which had seemed invulnerable after Formosa, were suddenly bleeding. But the American response was already forming. Radar operators were learning to identify kamikaze approach patterns. Fighter directors were developing new intercept tactics. Anti-aircraft crews were adapting their fire to destroy rather than merely damage attacking aircraft. The mathematics that had created the kamikaze threat would eventually defeat it. But that victory would cost thousands of American lives and tens of thousands of Japanese lives. And it would all trace back to one moment. The lie told after Formosa. The false victory that convinced Japanese commanders their conventional forces still had a chance. The deception that delayed the kamikaze decision until American forces were already in the Philippines. In Part 3, we will witness the full fury of kamikaze warfare, the battles that cost America more sailors than any other campaign in the Pacific, the desperate defense of carriers that had seemed untouchable, and the terrible mathematics of suicide calculated in blood and steel. The divine wind was rising, and nothing would ever be the same. October 25, 1944, Philippine Sea. In Part 1, you witnessed Task Force 38 destroy 230 Japanese aircraft in a single day over Formosa. 15 minutes of warning. Overwhelming American firepower. Japanese air power shattered beyond repair. In Part 2, you saw how Japanese commanders responded to this catastrophe with a lie. They claimed victory when they had suffered devastating defeat. That lie convinced Tokyo to proceed with Operation Show 1, the defense of the Philippines based on false assumptions. And from that lie emerged something far more terrifying: the kamikaze. Organized suicide attacks designed to overcome American superiority through the mathematics of certain death. On October 25, 1944, a single kamikaze Zero sank the escort carrier St. Lo. 1 in 13 Americans dead. The first major warship destroyed by deliberate suicide attack. Japanese commanders celebrated. They had found a weapon that worked. American carriers were no longer invulnerable. But the Americans were already adapting. And what happened next would determine whether the divine wind could truly turn the tide of the Pacific War. The answer would be written in blood, steel, and mathematics that favored the nation with 17 carriers against the nation with barely functioning 4. The sinking of St. Lo sent shockwaves through the American Naval Command. Vice Admiral Mark Mitcher, commanding the fast carriers of Task Force 38, reviewed the action reports with growing concern. The kamikaze attack had succeeded not through superior tactics, but through commitment. The Japanese pilot had absorbed anti-aircraft fire that would have forced any conventional attacker to abort. He had pressed his attack through a wall of steel because he did not intend to survive. This changed everything. American anti-aircraft doctrine was designed to damage attacking aircraft, forcing pilots to break off their attacks or miss their targets. Against kamikazes, damage was insufficient. Only destruction would stop them. Mitcher ordered immediate changes. Combat air patrol coverage was expanded. Fighter directors received new instructions prioritizing complete destruction of incoming aircraft rather than merely turning them away. Anti-aircraft gunners were told to keep firing until targets disintegrated or crashed into the sea. The 40mm Bofors guns proved most effective. They could destroy aircraft at ranges where 20mm cannons merely damaged them. Additional 40mm mounts were requested for all carriers. The Americans were learning. But the kamikazes kept coming. November 1st. Kamikaze attacks damaged the carriers Lexington and Cabot. November 5th. More attacks. November 25th. The carriers Essex, Intrepid, and Cabot were all hit. None were sunk, but all required repairs. American casualties mounted. By the end of November 1944, kamikaze attacks had killed over 700 American sailors and damaged 16 ships. The mathematics that had seemed so favorable after Formosa now looked different. Japan was trading barely trained pilots in obsolete aircraft for damage to irreplaceable American carriers. But the mathematics still favored America. For every carrier damaged, Japan lost dozens of aircraft and pilots. American shipyards could repair damaged carriers in weeks. Japanese aircraft factories could not replace losses fast enough to sustain the kamikaze campaign indefinitely. Admiral Toyota understood this. He ordered an acceleration of the program. More volunteers were recruited. Training was shortened from weeks to days. Aircraft were modified to carry larger bomb loads. The Special Attack Corps expanded from hundreds to thousands of pilots waiting for the order to die. The American response evolved continuously. Radar picket destroyers were deployed in rings around the carrier task force, providing early warning of incoming attacks. Fighter patrols were stationed at multiple altitudes, creating layered defenses. New proximity-fused shells for the 5-inch guns exploded near aircraft, without requiring direct hits, greatly increasing kill probability. The VT fuse, as it was called, became the most closely guarded secret in the Pacific Fleet. Each shell contained a tiny radar transmitter that detonated the explosive when it passed close to an aircraft. Accuracy increased by a factor of 4. Kamikazes that had survived conventional anti-aircraft fire now exploded in mid-air, torn apart by proximity detonations. The kill rate climbed. But so did the number of attackers. Japan was committing everything to the kamikaze campaign, and the bloodiest battle was yet to come. April 1st, 1945. Okinawa. The invasion of Okinawa began with the largest amphibious operation of the Pacific War. 500 ships, 180,000 troops. Task Force 58. The redesignated Fast Carrier Force provided air support with 17 carriers, launching continuous strikes against Japanese positions. Japan responded with Operation Tengo, the final defensive effort of the Imperial Japanese Navy. And the centerpiece of Tengo was not battleships or cruisers. It was kamikazes. 900 aircraft were allocated for suicide attacks against the American fleet at Okinawa. This was not a raid. This was a campaign. The attacks would continue for 3 months. They would kill more American sailors than any other battle in Pacific history. The first mass kamikaze attack, designated Kikusui No. 1, struck on April 6th. 355 kamikazes and 344 conventional aircraft launched from Kyushu. American radar detected them at extreme range. Fighter directors vectored over 300 Hellcats and Corsairs toward the incoming strike. The air battle lasted 6 hours. American fighters shot down 233 Japanese aircraft before they reached the fleet. But 122 kamikazes penetrated the fighter screen. They hit the radar picket destroyers first. USS Bush, USS Colhoun, USS Emmons. Small ships with small crews positioned at the outer edge of the defensive perimeter. They absorbed kamikaze after kamikaze, their anti-aircraft guns firing, until they were destroyed. Bush took 4 kamikazes. She sank with 94 men dead. Colhoun took 5. She went down with 35 killed. Emmons took 5 kamikazes and 4 bombs. 60 men killed. The destroyers died buying time for the carriers. Their sacrifice allowed fighter directors to vector additional interceptors toward the surviving kamikazes. Of the 122 that penetrated initial defenses, 73 were shot down by anti-aircraft fire or late intercepting fighters. 49 struck American ships. The carrier Hancock took a kamikaze that killed 72 men. The battleship Maryland was hit. The destroyers Newcomb and Lutze were damaged. By nightfall on April 6th, 6 American ships had been sunk and 21 damaged. American casualties exceeded 700 killed and wounded. Japanese losses were 355 aircraft and pilots, plus 183 conventional aircraft shot down. One day, 538 Japanese aircraft destroyed. But the attacks would continue. April 12th, Kikusui, No. 2, 185 kamikazes. April 16th, Kikusui No. 3, 165 kamikazes. April 27th to 28th, Kikusui No. 4, 115 kamikazes. Each attack followed the same pattern. Mass launch from Kyushu. American fighters intercepting at maximum range. Kamikazes pressing through to the fleet. Radar picket destroyers absorbing the initial blows. Carriers maneuvering at maximum speed, while anti-aircraft guns filled the sky with steel. The carrier Bunker Hill was hit on May 11th. 2 kamikazes struck within 30 seconds. 393 men killed. 264 wounded. The ship survived but required 6 months of repairs. The carrier Enterprise was hit on May 14th. 14 killed, 34 wounded. 34. Enterprise had been attacked more times than any ship in the Pacific. She survived again. But the cumulative toll was staggering. By the end of the Okinawa campaign, kamikaze attacks had sunk 36 American ships and damaged 368 others. 4,900 American sailors died. 4,800 were wounded. These were the highest naval casualties of any American campaign in history. Higher than Pearl Harbor. Higher than any battle in the Atlantic. The divine wind had extracted a terrible price. But it had failed. The kamikazes failed because the mathematics remained unfavorable despite the horrific toll. Japan launched approximately 1,900 suicide aircraft against the Okinawa fleet. They sank 36 ships, none of them fleet carriers or battleships. The American fast carrier force remained intact throughout the campaign, launching continuous strikes against Okinawa and the Japanese home islands. American aircraft losses were replaced within days. American ships were repaired within weeks. American sailors who died were mourned, but the campaign continued without pause. Japan could not replace its losses. The 1,900 kamikaze pilots were gone forever. The aircraft factories that built their planes were being systematically destroyed by B-29 bombing raids. The fuel supplies that powered their final flights were being interdicted by American submarines. Each Kikusui attack was smaller than the last because Japan was running out of pilots, aircraft, and fuel. By June 1945, the kamikaze campaign at Okinawa had effectively ended. Not because Japan chose to stop, but because Japan had exhausted its capacity to continue. The divine wind had blown itself out against American steel, American production, and American mathematics. The same industrial superiority that had overwhelmed Japanese conventional forces at Formosa now overwhelmed Japanese suicide attacks at Okinawa. Task Force 58 finished the Okinawa campaign with 15 operational carriers. Japan finished with no operational carriers at all. The lessons of Okinawa spread rapidly through the American fleet. Anti-aircraft doctrine was revised. Radar picket tactics were refined. Fighter direction procedures were improved. The proximity fuse was deployed in increasing numbers. Kill rates against kamikazes climbed from 50% in April to over 70% by June. More importantly, American morale remained unbroken. The kamikaze campaign had been designed to shatter American will to fight. Instead, it had hardened American determination. Sailors who survived kamikaze attacks returned to duty with grim resolve. They understood they were fighting an enemy willing to die. They responded by becoming more efficient at killing. The final Kikusui attack number 10, launched on June 21st and 22nd, consisted of only 45 kamikazes. American fighters and anti-aircraft fire destroyed all but 7. Those 7 damaged 3 ships and sank none. The divine wind had become a breeze, and behind the carrier task force, B-29 bombers were already preparing for something far more devastating than any kamikaze attack. The atomic bombs that would end the war were being assembled on Tinian. The mathematics that had doomed Japanese carrier aviation at Formosa, that had made kamikazes necessary, and that had ultimately defeated the kamikaze campaign, would find its ultimate expression in a single weapon that made industrial production of conventional forces irrelevant. But that is a story for Part 4. Because the men who survived the kamikaze campaign carried scars that lasted far longer than the war. The pilots who launched from Task Force 38 on that October morning over Formosa, the sailors who manned anti-aircraft guns through 3 months of suicide attacks at Okinawa, the commanders who made the decisions that sent thousands to their deaths on both sides. What happened to them after the war ended? What lessons did they draw from the most destructive naval campaign in history? And what did this battle mean for the future of warfare? The final chapter of this story has never been fully told. Until now. August 15, 1945. Tokyo, Japan. In Part 1, you witnessed the most devastating carrier strike in Pacific history. Task Force 38 launched 480 aircraft from 8 carriers against Formosa. Japanese commanders had 15 minutes of warning. They watched 230 aircraft destroyed in a single day. The mathematics were brutal. For every American aircraft lost, Japan lost 6. In Part 2, you saw how Japanese commanders responded with a LIE. They claimed victory when they had suffered catastrophic defeat. That lie convinced Tokyo to proceed with Operation Show 1 based on false assumptions. And from that lie emerged the kamikaze program. Organized suicide attacks designed to overcome American superiority through certain death. In Part 3, you witness the kamikaze campaign at Okinawa. 1,900 suicide aircraft. 36 American ships sunk. 4,900 American sailors killed, the highest naval casualties of any American campaign in history. But the kamikazes failed. American industrial capacity replaced every loss while Japan exhausted itself. Now the war is over. Emperor Hirohito has announced Japan's surrender. But the story is not complete, because the men who made the decisions that shaped this campaign faced consequences that history has largely forgotten. And the legacy they left behind extends far beyond World War II into the conflicts of today. Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi sat alone in his office on the night of August 15, 1945. The Emperor's surrender broadcast had ended hours earlier. Japan's war was over. Onishi had created the kamikaze program. He had sent approximately 4,000 young men to their deaths in suicide attacks. He had promised them their sacrifice would save Japan. Now Japan had surrendered unconditionally. Their deaths had accomplished nothing except to delay the inevitable by a few months. Onishi understood what he had done. He had asked young men to die for a cause that was already lost. He had given them meaning in death while knowing death would not bring victory. He had exploited their courage, their loyalty, their willingness to sacrifice everything for their nation, and he had failed them. At 2:00 a.m. on August 16, 1945, Onishi committed seppuku ritual suicide by disembowelment. He left a note apologizing to the spirits of the kamikaze pilots and their families. He refused assistance that would have hastened his death. He died slowly over 15 hours, suffering deliberately as penance for the suffering he had caused. Onishi was 54 years old. He never saw the Japan that would rise from the ashes of defeat. He never saw the economic miracle that would transform his devastated nation into the world's second-largest economy. He saw only the mathematics of failure, the certain knowledge that he had sent thousands of young men to die for nothing. Admiral Suemu Toyota, commander of the combined fleet, survived the war. He was arrested by American occupation authorities and tried for war crimes. The prosecution argued that he bore responsibility for the kamikaze program and other atrocities. Toyota defended himself by claiming he had opposed suicide attacks but was overruled by subordinates and circumstances. The tribunal acquitted him. He spent the remainder of his life in quiet obscurity, rarely speaking about the war. He died in 1957 at age 72. Vice Admiral Shigeru Fukudomi, the man who had stood in the ruins of 2nd Air Fleet headquarters watching Formosa burn, also survived. He had tried to communicate the truth about the Formosa air battle to Tokyo. His messages had been ignored. He had watched as false victory claims led to strategic decisions that doomed Operation Show 1 before it began. Fukudome testified at war crimes trials and cooperated with American historians documenting the Pacific War. He provided detailed accounts of Japanese naval operations, including the decisions that led to kamikaze attacks. He died in 1971 at age 80, having witnessed Japan's transformation from enemy to ally. Captain Toshikazu Omai, who had received that first reconnaissance report on the morning of October 12, 1944, disappeared from historical records after the war. Like thousands of mid-level Japanese officers, he returned to civilian life and faded into anonymity. Whether he prospered or struggled, whether he made peace with what he had witnessed or carried the burden forever, history does not record. But the legacy of the decisions made that morning extended far beyond any individual fate. The Formosa air battle and the subsequent kamikaze campaign taught American naval planners lessons that shaped military doctrine for decades. The importance of radar early warning became doctrine. The proximity fuse, which had proven so devastating against kamikazes, was developed into increasingly sophisticated weapons. The Combat Information Center concept, which had allowed American fighters to be vectored against incoming threats with precision, evolved into the modern Aegis combat system that protects American carriers today. The mathematics of the Formosa campaign proved something that military theorists had debated for centuries. Industrial capacity determines the outcome of prolonged warfare. Japan started World War II with 6 fleet carriers and some of the most skilled naval aviators in history. The United States started with 3 carriers and pilots still learning their craft. By October 1944, Japan had 4 barely operational carriers with minimal air groups. The United States had 17 fleet and light carriers in the Fast Carrier Task Force alone, plus dozens of escort carriers with thousands of trained pilots flowing from training schools. This reversal occurred in less than 3 years. American shipyards produced carriers faster than Japan could sink them. American training programs produced pilots faster than Japan could kill them. American factories produced aircraft faster than Japan could destroy them. Every engagement eroded Japanese strength, while American strength grew continuously. The kamikaze program was Japan's attempt to overcome these mathematics through willingness to die. It failed because even suicide attacks could not change the fundamental industrial equation. Japan launched approximately 4,000 kamikaze sorties during the war. They sank 47 ships and damaged 300 others. They killed approximately 4,900 American sailors and wounded 4,800 more. These were horrific losses, but they did not sink a single American fleet carrier. They did not stop a single American amphibious operation. They did not delay the end of the war by more than a few weeks at most. The mathematics remained unfavorable. For every American ship sunk, Japan lost approximately 85 aircraft and pilots. This was not sustainable. It was not victory. It was organized desperation transformed into doctrine. Modern military analysts study the kamikaze campaign not as a model to emulate, but as a warning about what happens when nations face overwhelming material disadvantage and choose ideology over rationality. The suicide attacks demonstrated extraordinary individual courage. They also demonstrated institutional failure to acknowledge strategic reality. Japan lost the war not because its soldiers lacked courage, but because its leaders lacked the wisdom to recognize when courage was insufficient. The carrier task force that struck Formosa in October 1944 represented something new in military history: mobile air power capable of projecting overwhelming force anywhere within operational range. This concept evolved into the carrier battle groups that dominate American naval strategy today. The 11 nuclear-powered aircraft carriers currently operated by the United States Navy are direct descendants of the Essex-class carriers that devastated Formosa 80 years ago. Their aircraft are faster, more capable, more lethal. But the fundamental principle remains identical. Concentrate air power in mobile platforms. Strike before the enemy can respond. Maintain operational tempo that opponents cannot match. The 15-minute warning that Japanese commanders had at Formosa would be measured in seconds against modern carrier aircraft and missiles. The lessons of the Formosa air battle extend beyond military doctrine into questions of leadership innovation and institutional honesty. Japanese commanders lied about the battle results. They claimed victory when they had suffered devastating defeat. This lie was not born from malice, but from institutional pressure. Japan needed a victory. National morale required good news. The military establishment required justification for continued resistance. So commanders exaggerated, superiors accepted the exaggerations, and strategy was built on fantasy rather than reality. This pattern has repeated throughout military history. Commanders report what their superiors want to hear. Intelligence is shaped to support predetermined conclusions. Inconvenient facts are dismissed or ignored. The result is strategic decisions based on false assumptions, leading to defeats that accurate information might have prevented. The American military learned from this example. The intelligence failures that allowed Pearl Harbor, the optimistic assessments that prolonged Vietnam, the weapons of mass destruction, claims that justified Iraq. Each failure prompted institutional reforms designed to prevent repetition. Whether those reforms succeeded is debatable. The tendency to believe what we want to believe, to accept information that confirms our assumptions, remains powerful even in the most sophisticated institutions. The innovation lesson cuts deeper. The kamikaze program emerged because conventional tactics had failed completely. Japanese commanders recognized that ordinary attacks could not penetrate American defenses. Rather than accept defeat, they invented a new approach that sacrificed pilot lives for increased effectiveness. This was innovation driven by desperation. Morally questionable, strategically futile, but innovative nonetheless. History is filled with similar examples. The tank was developed because trench warfare had reached stalemate. The atomic bomb was developed because conventional bombing was insufficiently destructive. The drone was developed because manned aircraft were becoming too expensive and pilots too valuable to risk. Each innovation emerged from the recognition that existing approaches were inadequate. Each transformed warfare in ways that creators could not fully anticipate. The kamikaze represents the dark side of military innovation. Creativity in service of destruction. Ingenuity applied to killing rather than saving. The courage required to fly a suicide mission was undeniable. The wisdom of creating a system that demanded such courage was not. There is one final detail that most historians overlook. The reconnaissance pilot who spotted Task Force 38 on the morning of October 12, 1944, was Lieutenant Takeshi Yamada. He was 23 years old. He transmitted the sighting that gave Japanese commanders their 15 minutes of warning. Then he turned away and flew back toward Formosa before American fighters could intercept him. Yamada survived that day. He survived the entire Formosa campaign. He survived the war. In 1947, he emigrated to Brazil as part of the Japanese diaspora that scattered across the world after defeat. He became a farmer in São Paulo state, growing coffee and raising a family. He never spoke publicly about his wartime service. But in 1984, when he was 63 years old, a Japanese journalist tracked him down for an interview about the Formosa air battle. Yamada was reluctant to speak. 40 years had passed. He had built a new life. The war seemed like something that had happened to a different person. But eventually, he agreed to share one memory. The journalist asked what he remembered most clearly about that morning. Yamada thought for a long moment. Then he said something that captured everything about the Pacific War in a single sentence. "I remember counting the carriers," he said. 8 of them. And I knew we were going to lose. I knew it when I saw them. We all knew. We just could not say it. That silence, that inability to speak truth to power, that institutional pressure to deny obvious reality, cost Japan the war and cost thousands of young men their lives. Yamada died in 1996 at age 75, having outlived nearly everyone who had stood in that Formosa operations room reading his reconnaissance report. The story of the Formosa air battle is ultimately not about carriers or aircraft or even kamikazes. It is about mathematics. The mathematics of industrial production that determined which nation could build faster than the other could destroy. The mathematics of attrition that favored the side with unlimited replacements. The mathematics of suicide attacks that could not change the fundamental equation no matter how many young men were willing to die. From a single reconnaissance report delivered at Aero 615 on October 12, 1944, to the largest kamikaze campaign in history, to Japan's unconditional surrender 9 months later. The thread connecting these events was mathematical inevitability that Japanese commanders understood but could not accept. Task Force 38 demonstrated that American carrier aviation had achieved absolute superiority. The kamikaze campaign demonstrated that even suicide could not overcome that superiority. The final surrender demonstrated that courage, without industrial capacity, leads only to prolonged suffering. 900 American sailors died at Okinawa. 4,000 Japanese pilots died in kamikaze attacks. Tens of thousands more died in the fighting that continued, while Japan's leaders debated whether to accept defeat. Every one of those deaths occurred after the mathematics had already determined the outcome. If you have watched all 4 parts of this documentary, you have invested 90 minutes in understanding a single truth. Wars are not won by the side with the most courage. Wars are won by the side that combines courage with capacity. The capacity to produce, to replace, to sustain operations indefinitely while the enemy exhausts itself. Japan had courage in abundance. Japan lacked capacity. That single fact determined everything that followed. The next time you read about military history, ask yourself not who was braver, but who could produce more faster longer. The answer to that question usually predicts the answer to who won. Thank you for watching. If you know other stories where mathematics determined military outcomes, share them in the comments. And subscribe for more deep dives into the history that shaped our world. Because sometimes the most important battles are fought not with weapons, but with numbers.